My heart went cold when I saw the empty sacks in the barn. It wasn't because of the loss, but because I knew exactly who had done it. I felt deeply violated, a feeling that went all the way to the roots of my hair, and then it didn't take long for her to appear, pointing triumphantly at the barn. She spouted heavy accusations, acting as if she were the victim. She had committed both theft and slander, turning the situation completely around. She believed her title as HOA President was enough to hide her wrongdoing. But what she didn't know was that each sack she greedily carried away contained the very proof that would lead to her downfall. Before the chaos began, Meadowbrook was a quiet neighborhood where I had lived in peace for 15 years. My life was simple. I tended to my 20 acres of wheat, always wearing the same red and blue plaid shirt and an old cowboy hat. My neighbors knew me as the quiet man who sold his grain to the local mills. I was Jake Thompson, 47 years old, a lifelong farmer with no interest in trouble. That all changed when Sarah Martinez arrived. She was 38 with perfectly styled curly blonde hair and always dressed in sharp black and white suits. Soon after moving into our community, she was elected HOA President. With great enthusiasm, she promised to improve our property values. But her mission quickly became personal, and for some reason, I became her first target. It was the start of a 6-month war that would shake our entire neighborhood, but why would Sarah target me? I was a peaceful farmer who just wanted to live quietly and take care of my small backyard garden. The answer would soon become clear. It was all about power, control, and a huge mistake she made about what was really in those brown sacks in my barn. What started as a simple delivery of organic fertilizer would turn into the biggest drama Meadowbrook had ever seen. The conflict started on a crisp October morning. I had hauled home a truckload of dried cow manure for my composting fertilizer. I'd been buying this organic gold from Miller's farm for years. I knew it would make my tomatoes and corn grow like they were on steroids. The delivery truck rumbled down our quiet street, and I had the driver stack the 50-pound sacks in my barn, just like always. But this time, I had a secret audience. Sarah saw those brown burlap sacks being unloaded, and her eyes lit up as if she had discovered buried treasure. Within 2 hours, I found a crisp white envelope in my mailbox. It was the first warning letter. It read, "Commercial activities not permitted in residential areas. Immediate cessation required." The letter was typed on official HOA letterhead and was filled with more legal-sounding words than a Supreme Court decision. That evening, I knocked on her door to explain that it was just fertilizer for my garden. Sarah stood in her doorway like a guard at a fortress. Her arms were crossed, and she was full of suspicion. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice filled with a new, cold authority, "I wasn't born yesterday. Those are clearly grain sacks, and I have photographic evidence of your commercial wheat operation." She waved a thick manila folder, which I guessed was full of photos of my truck. "I'm giving you 72 hours to stop all commercial activities." When I politely refused her demand to inspect my barn, explaining that it was my private property, Sarah's face turned as red as a ripe tomato. "We'll see about that," she hissed. I knew then this was only the beginning. The tension grew faster than a rocket launch. Sarah began what she called her comprehensive investigation into my supposed crimes. She hired a private detective, a slimy little man named Rick, who drove a beat-up sedan. He thought he was invisible while following my bright red pickup truck all over town. Every morning at 5:30, I'd see Rick parked across the street, the lens of his camera glinting in the early sunlight. He documented my every move as if I were running a drug cartel, not just hauling wheat to the grain elevator. At the next HOA meeting, Sarah made a grand declaration. The meeting was held in Mrs. Patterson's living room with about 20 neighbors. Crammed together like sardines, Sarah announced that I was illegally transporting wheat and turning our peaceful neighborhood into a commercial warehouse district. She had prepared a PowerPoint presentation so elaborate it would have made a big company CEO proud. It was complete with aerial photos of my property, which she had somehow gotten, with red arrows pointing to my barn as if it were a missile silo. The first major conflict began when Sarah started fining me amounts that would make a loan shark blush. In week 1, I got a $200 ticket because my truck was parked on the street for longer than the 4-hour limit. I had literally only stopped to unload my groceries. Week 2 brought a $500 fine for early morning noise violations because I had started my truck at 6 a.m. to head to the fields. The ticket claimed that excessive diesel engine noise before 7 a.m. was a breach of community peace. In week 3, I got hit with the biggest fine yet, $1,000 for odor violations from improperly stored agricultural materials. This was especially ridiculous. The dried cow manure had been properly composted and sealed in bags. It smelled no more than a bag of potting soil. I was starting to realize that Sarah had declared war, and she was using the HOA rule book as her weapon of mass destruction. The situation went from annoying to truly disturbing. Sarah formed what she proudly called the Special Oversight Committee for Community Standards Enforcement. This team was made up of 3 of her closest friends: Janet Morrison, a retired librarian who treated every tiny rule violation like a federal crime; Bob Fletcher, an accountant who measured his lawn with a ruler to make sure it was the perfect height; and Patricia Williams, a woman who had once called the police because a neighbor's dog barked twice in one afternoon. This trio began what they called neighborhood patrols, but they felt more like surveillance missions. Every morning, I'd see them at the edge of my property with clipboards, cameras, and measuring tapes. They documented everything, from the angle of my mailbox to the number of newspapers in my driveway. Some days I'd catch them standing by my fence, counting the sacks in my barn through the gaps in the wooden slats, whispering among themselves as if they were planning a military operation. Things got even worse when Sarah decided to take our dispute to the authorities. She filed a formal complaint with the county tax assessor, claiming I was running an undeclared commercial grain storage facility and owed thousands in back taxes. She contacted the fire department, insisting my barn contained highly flammable materials that violated safety codes. She even called the police to report suspicious commercial activity in our residential neighborhood. This flood of official complaints forced me to take whole days off work. I had to meet with different officials, explaining over and over that I was just a simple wheat farmer with some dried manure for my garden. The fire chief, a reasonable man named Captain Rodriguez, actually laughed when he inspected my barn and realized what Sarah was complaining about. "Mr. Thompson," he said, shaking his head, "I've seen some petty neighbor disputes in my time, but this lady has a wild imagination." The peak of Sarah's campaign of oppression came when she decided to make our dispute public in the most dramatic way she could. She organized a press conference at the community center, complete with rented folding chairs, a podium borrowed from the local church, and a professionally printed banner. Local reporters showed up, probably expecting a major city corruption scandal. Instead, they found Sarah pointing dramatically at giant, blown-up photographs of my barn. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Sarah announced, her voice filled with the seriousness of someone declaring the end of the world, "I have uncovered a conspiracy to transform our peaceful neighborhood into an industrial agricultural zone." She had a whole presentation ready that would have impressed someone at the Pentagon, complete with aerial maps, traffic charts, and what she called photographic evidence of systematic commercial grain distribution. The local newspaper reporter looked confused, but Sarah pushed forward, painting me as some kind of agricultural supervillain who was threatening the very fabric of suburban life. The fourth conflict really pushed me to my breaking point. Sarah launched what could only be called a social warfare campaign. She started systematically turning my neighbors against me. She used a combination of fear-mongering and social pressure that would have made a professional political strategist proud. She convinced one family that my commercial activities were lowering their property values. She told the Johnsons that my truck starting in the morning was giving their baby sleep problems. She even persuaded Mrs. Chen that the smell from my barn was triggering her allergies, even though Mrs. Chen lived 4 houses away. The social isolation became almost unbearable. Sarah convinced the neighborhood mothers to stop letting their children play with my grandson, Tommy, when he visited on weekends. 8-year-old Tommy couldn't understand why his friends suddenly weren't allowed to come over, why he stopped getting birthday party invitations, or why the other kids at the community pool avoided him. Watching my grandson's confusion and hurt was like a knife to my heart. I realized Sarah had crossed a line. She was no longer just an annoying neighbor. She was a genuine threat to my family's well-being. In the final weeks before the confrontation in my barn, Sarah's behavior became increasingly wild and aggressive. She hired a lawyer, some slick downtown type in a $1,000 suit, who sent me threatening letters about maintaining community standards and legal consequences. She organized concerned citizen meetings where neighbors gathered to discuss the Jake Thompson problem, as if I were some kind of natural disaster that needed to be dealt with. Sarah's single quote-s crowning achievement was convincing the HOA board to pass an emergency resolution. This gave her enhanced powers to deal with persistent violators like me. It basically meant she could find me, inspect my property, and generally make my life miserable, all with the full backing of the community organization. What she didn't realize was that during this entire 6-month campaign of harassment, I had been quietly documenting everything. I was just waiting for the right moment to reveal who I really was and what I really knew about the law. What Sarah didn't know, and what none of my neighbors knew, was that Jake Thompson, the simple wheat farmer, was actually Jake Thompson, the former state agricultural inspector. For 12 years before I started farming full-time, I had worked for the Colorado Department of Agriculture. I investigated everything from grain elevator fraud to illegal pesticide use. I knew agricultural law better than most lawyers. I understood property rights like a constitutional expert and had spent years building solid legal cases against people who thought they could abuse their power. I had been letting Sarah dig her own grave. I was documenting every illegal fine, every improper inspection, and every abuse of her HOA power. I knew the exact moment she had crossed from being an annoying neighbor into committing actual crimes. I was just waiting for her to give me the perfect opportunity to spring my trap. That opportunity came on a cold February morning when Sarah finally decided to take matters into her own hands and conduct her own inspection of my barn, right after Sarah and her 3-man enforcement team left my barn confused. Having discovered that the smell definitely wasn't wheat, I calmly walked into my house. I made the phone call I had been planning for months. Marcus Rodriguez's law office came the familiar voice of my old friend's receptionist. Please tell him Jake Thompson is ready to move forward with the Meadowbrook situation, I said. Marcus Rodriguez had been my legal advisor during my inspector days. He was a sharp lawyer who specialized in agricultural law and property rights. When I first told him about Sarah's harassment campaign 3 months earlier, he had advised patience. Let her hang herself, Jake, he had said. Document everything. Stay calm, and when she finally goes too far, we'll have an airtight case. Well, breaking into my barn with her unauthorized team definitely counted as going too far. Within 48 hours, Marcus had completed what he called a comprehensive legal review of Sarah's entire 8-month reign of terror. The results were even more damning than I had hoped. Jake, this woman has violated so many laws, I don't know where to start, Marcus told me over coffee at Miller's Diner. First, he began, she changed the HOA bylaws on her own without notifying homeowners or getting a proper vote. Under Colorado law, any changes to these documents require a 30-day notice period and a majority vote of all homeowners, not just the board members. He continued, the illegal fines were just the tip of the iceberg. She's been charging you $500 to $1,000 for each violation. Marcus spread documents across the table like a poker dealer. But the most serious discovery was her use of HOA funds for her personal vendettas. She spent $15,000 of the community's money on private investigators, legal fees, and that ridiculous press conference. Marcus's voice rose with professional anger. That's embezzlement, pure and simple. In Colorado, misusing homeowners association funds is a felony punishable by up to 6 years in prison and full repayment of the money. The second phase of my counterattack came from an unexpected ally, David Martinez, Sarah's own husband. 3 days after the barn incident, David appeared at my door. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Jake, I owe you an apology, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion and shame. My wife has lost her mind with this HOA power trip, and I can't stand it anymore. David revealed that he'd been trying to control Sarah's behavior for months, but she had become obsessed with maintaining community standards. She spends hours every day taking pictures of neighbors' houses, measuring grass, timing how long people park on the street, he told me, shaking his head in disbelief. Last week, I found her going through our financial records, trying to find ways to use our own money to fund more investigations into you and other neighbors. More importantly, David agreed to provide crucial evidence of Sarah's conspiracy. I have copies of all her emails to the Oversight Committee, he said, pulling out a thick folder. Jake, you need to see what she's been writing about you. She's been planning this whole campaign like it's some kind of military operation. The emails were even worse than I'd imagined, filled with phrases like total neighborhood elimination of the Thompson problem and escalated enforcement until voluntary relocation occurs. My third ally came from the most unexpected source, Mrs. Helen Rodriguez, the 78-year-old widow who lived in the corner house and usually kept to herself. Helen had always seemed like a sweet old lady who minded her own business, so I was shocked. When she knocked on my door carrying a shoebox, it was full of what she called evidence. "Jake, honey," Helen said in her soft, grandmotherly voice, "I've been watching that horrible woman terrorize this neighborhood for months, and I've been documenting everything." She opened the shoebox to reveal dozens of photos, a detailed journal, and several USB drives. "I may be old, but I'm not blind," she said. "I've been taking pictures every time Sarah and her little gang trespass on people's property. And I've got video footage of things that would make your hair curl." Helen's evidence was a gold mine of Sarah's illegal activities. She had documented at least 15 times Sarah had entered neighbors' yards without permission. There were photos of the oversight committee going through people's trash looking for evidence of violations and recordings of Sarah's phone calls, where she discussed plans to make life so unpleasant for certain residents that they'll have no choice but to move. And the breaking point for me, Helen continued, was when I saw what she did to poor Mr. Foster. Gerald Foster was an 82-year-old World War II veteran who lived alone in a small house he'd owned for 40 years. Helen's photos showed Sarah and her committee measuring Mr. Foster's fence, documenting minor maintenance issues, and basically harassing the old man for violations that didn't even exist. She's been threatening to fine him into bankruptcy unless he sells his house to some development company, Helen revealed, her gentle voice growing hard with anger. "Jake, that poor man fought in the Pacific Theater, survived the Depression, and raised 6 children in that house. If Sarah thinks she can bully him out of his home, she's got another thing coming." Armed with this evidence, I was ready to launch the final phase of my counterattack. I contacted Tom Bradley, the investigative reporter for Channel 7 News, whom I had worked with on several big agricultural fraud cases during my inspector days. "Tom, remember that grain elevator embezzlement case we worked on 5 years ago?" I asked when he answered his phone. "I've got something even better for you. How would you like to expose the biggest HOA corruption scandal this state has ever seen?" Tom was immediately interested, especially when I mentioned the embezzlement and the harassment of elderly residents. "Jake, this sounds like exactly the kind of story our viewers love," he said enthusiastically. "Corrupt officials, abuse of power, a small-town David versus Goliath story. When can we meet?" We arranged to meet the next day to review all the evidence and plan what Tom called the most satisfying takedown interview of my career, but before we could execute our media strategy, Sarah made a critical mistake that would speed up her own downfall. Feeling the pressure from the growing number of neighbor complaints and probably sensing her authority was being questioned, she decided to organize an emergency community meeting. Her goal was to deal with what she called the ongoing Thompson crisis and final resolution thereof. The meeting invitation was delivered to every house in the neighborhood. It was a masterpiece of dramatic exaggeration, promising definitive action on ongoing commercial violations and a final resolution of persistent neighborhood disruption. Reading between the lines, it was clear she intended to use the meeting to rally community support to either fine me into bankruptcy or somehow force me to move. What she didn't realize was that she was about to walk into a perfectly prepared trap that would end her reign of terror once and for all. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening at 7 p.m. at the Meadowbrook Community Center, a modest building that usually hosted bingo nights and kids' birthday parties. By 6:30, cars were lined up down the street. Nearly 200 residents showed up, the largest community gathering in our neighborhood's 20-year history. Word had spread that this meeting would finally settle the drama between me and Sarah Martinez, and nobody wanted to miss the fireworks. Sarah had transformed the community center into something that looked like a courtroom. She had a raised platform, with a podium borrowed from the local church. She had rented a professional projection system, arranged folding chairs in perfect rows, and even hung a banner across the back wall that read, "Meadowbrook Community Standards Enforcement." The whole setup screamed of someone trying way too hard to look official and intimidating. At exactly 7 p.m., Sarah called the meeting to order with a wooden gavel she had bought for the occasion. "Fellow residents of Meadowbrook," she began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who truly believed she was saving civilization itself. "We gather tonight to address the most serious threat our community has faced in its entire existence. Jake Thompson has systematically violated every principle of responsible neighborhood living, and tonight we take definitive action. For the next 25 minutes, Sarah delivered a presentation that would have impressed a prosecuting attorney. She had dozens of PowerPoint slides showing aerial photos of my property, charts of my truck's movements, and what she called photographic evidence of a systematic commercial grain storage and distribution operation. She displayed charts showing a decline in property values, which she blamed on my industrial activity. She even presented statements from neighbors about noise complaints and other disruptions. The evidence is overwhelming and irrefutable, Sarah declared, pointing dramatically at a slide of my barn. Jake Thompson has transformed residential property into commercial warehouse space, violating zoning laws, HOA regulations, and basic community standards. Tonight, we vote to impose maximum fines, demand an immediate stop to all commercial activities, and, if necessary, start legal action to force him to comply or move. A few people clapped her special oversight committee and a handful of neighbors who had been convinced by her months of propaganda. But I noticed that most of the audience looked uncomfortable, doubtful, and, in some cases, just plain annoyed. Helen Rodriguez was sitting in the front row, shaking her head. David Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Several other neighbors were whispering to each other with expressions that showed they weren't buying Sarah's dramatic show. When Sarah asked, "Does anyone have questions or comments before we proceed to the vote?" I stood up slowly. I was still holding the coffee mug from my dinner at home. The entire hall fell silent except for the humming of the projection equipment. I walked calmly to the front of the room, pulled a USB drive from my shirt pocket, and addressed the crowd. I had the calm confidence of someone who had spent years presenting evidence in legal proceedings. "Thank you, Sarah, for organizing this meeting and giving me the chance to address these serious accusations," I began, my voice carrying easily through the room without needing to be loud. "I think it's important that our community has all the facts before making any decisions about my so-called crimes against suburban life. First," I continued, plugging my USB drive into her projection system, "let's address the main accusation that I'm running an illegal commercial wheat storage facility." The screen filled with photos I had taken that very morning of the contents of my barn. "I invite Sarah and anyone else who is interested to come to my house right now, tonight, after this meeting, to inspect those brown sacks that have caused so much concern. But what you'll find is about 2 tons of dried, composted cow manure that I purchased from Miller's farm to fertilize my backyard vegetable garden." A soft ripple of laughter went through the crowd as people began to understand the reality of the situation. Sarah's face was turning an interesting shade of red, but she remained defiant. "That's obviously a recent switch," she declared. "He's clearly moved the wheat to another location and replaced it with ... with whatever that is." Second, I continued, ignoring Sarah's outburst, "I'd like to share some information about how our HOA has been managed over the past 8 months. The screen changed to display detailed spreadsheets showing every fine that had been imposed during her presidency. According to Colorado state law, homeowners associations are limited to fines of $50 for a first violation and no more than $200 for repeat violations. However, our current president has been imposing fines ranging from $500 to $1,500, which violates state consumer protection laws. The murmuring in the audience grew louder as neighbors began to calculate how much they had been illegally overcharged. Mrs. Patterson called out, "She fined us $800 for having Gorgafen trance." Mr. Chen added, "800 for having Gorgafen trance." Mr. Chen added, $1,200, because our fence was supposedly 6 inches tall. Third, I said, changing the slides again to show the bank records Marcus had helped me get. "I have documents showing that our HOA president has spent over $18,000 of community funds on her personal projects. This includes private investigators, legal fees for her personal disputes, and tonight's theatrical presentation. Under Colorado law, this is embezzlement of homeowners association funds, which is a felony." The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors realized their monthly HOA fees had been funding Sarah's personal vendetta. "Where's our money going?" someone shouted. "She never asked permission for any of this," called another voice. Fourth, I continued, my voice staying calm despite the growing chaos. I have video evidence of systematic trespassing and harassment of multiple families in our neighborhood. Helen Rodriguez's carefully documented footage began to play, showing clear violations of property rights that would make any lawyer's mouth water. The video showed Sarah and her committee entering yards without permission, going through trash, and intimidating elderly residents. At this point, Tom Bradley appeared at the back of the room with his Channel 7 News camera crew. Good evening, everyone, Tom announced, his professional broadcaster's voice cutting through the noise. I'm Tom Bradley from Channel 7 Investigative News. We're here following reports of serious HOA misconduct and would like to get statements from community members about these allegations. Sarah looked like a deer caught in headlights, suddenly realizing her carefully planned show was turning into a public relations disaster of epic proportions. This is ... This is an illegal intrusion. She stammered, this is a private community meeting. Actually, Ms. Martinez, Tom replied smoothly, HOA meetings are required by law to be open to homeowners and, in cases involving potential criminal activity, to the press. Now, would you care to comment on these allegations of embezzlement and harassment? Finally, I said, getting the room's attention again, I need to address the most serious accusation against our HOA president. The screen changed to show documents about Sarah's threats against Gerald Foster. Mrs. Martinez has been systematically harassing Mr. Foster, an 82-year-old World War II veteran, trying to force him to sell his property to a development company in which she holds a financial interest. This is abuse of her position, elder abuse, and potentially a criminal scheme under federal law. Gerald Foster himself stood up slowly, his old body shaking with emotion. That woman threatened to fine me into bankruptcy if I didn't sell my house, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived both a war and the Great Depression. I fought in the Pacific for 3 years, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be driven out of my own home by some power-hungry official. The community center exploded with angry voices. People were standing up, shouting questions and accusations. David Martinez stepped forward, his face pale with shame and determination. I can't let this continue, he announced, his voice barely audible over the crowd. My wife has violated her oath of office, misused community funds, and brought disgrace to our neighborhood. I'm formally requesting an immediate vote of no confidence. Sarah made one last, desperate attempt to keep control. You're all being manipulated, she screamed over the chaos. This is a coordinated attack by someone who refuses to follow basic community standards. But her voice was lost in the crowd of angry neighbors who had finally realized they had been played for fools by someone they had trusted. The vote of no confidence was held immediately. Every homeowner present cast their ballot in a cardboard box that was borrowed from the community center's storage room. The results were announced by Mrs. Patterson, who had been chosen to run the vote. 189 votes to remove Sarah Martinez from office with only 4 votes against, she said. The 4 votes against were likely from her own oversight committee members. Tom Bradley captured the entire dramatic ending on camera. He interviewed neighbors about their experiences with Sarah's harassment and documented the community's unanimous rejection of her leadership. Mr. Thompson, Tom asked me as the crowd began to leave, what would you say to other homeowners who might be facing similar abuse from their HOA leadership? I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the families who might be watching this news report, dealing with their own neighborhood bullies. Know your rights, document everything, and never let anyone use a position of authority to intimidate you into giving up your legal protections. The law is on the side of property owners, not power-hungry officials who forget they are supposed to serve their community, not rule it. But the story was far from over. What happened in the weeks and months after Sarah's dramatic downfall would transform Meadowbrook. It went from a neighborhood divided by fear and suspicion into a model community that other HOAs would study and look up to. Within 72 hours of that meeting, Sarah Martinez and her family had vanished from Meadowbrook as if they had never existed. The moving trucks arrived at dawn on Monday, and by sunset, their house was empty, except for a few pieces of furniture that were too damaged or worthless to take. David Martinez left a handwritten note taped to every front door in the neighborhood. He apologized for his wife's behavior and included a check to repay each family for the illegal fines they had paid. The legal consequences for Sarah were swift and severe. The Colorado Attorney General's office filed criminal charges against her. The charges included embezzlement of homeowners association funds, abuse of her trusted position, conspiracy to commit fraud, and elder abuse for her treatment of Gerald Foster. The potential prison sentence ranged from 4 to 8 years, depending on how many charges she was convicted of. On top of that, she faced 17 separate civil lawsuits from neighbors seeking money for the harassment, illegal fines, and emotional distress she had caused. Tom Bradley's investigative report aired as a 3-part series titled HOA Hell: When Neighbors Become Dictators. The story went viral across the country. My quote about never underestimating a farmer who knows the law became an internet meme. It showed up on social media posts and even on protest signs at HOA meetings in other states. The story inspired similar investigations in dozens of other communities where homeowners had been suffering under abusive HOA leadership. The Meadowbrook community wasted no time in organizing new leadership elections. By a unanimous vote, they asked me to serve as the interim president while new, fairer bylaws were written and permanent officers were elected. I accepted the position, making it clear that my main goal was to create a system of checks and balances. This would prevent anyone from ever again gaining the kind of unchecked power that Sarah had abused. Our first order of business was establishing what we called the Meadowbrook Accountability Framework. This was a complete set of reforms that included required financial audits, limits on the president's authority, and required community approval for any spending over $100. We also created a citizen oversight board with the power to investigate complaints and remove officers for misconduct. Every decision had to be transparent, every dollar spent had to be justified, and every homeowner had access to all HOA records and financial information. We also created the Community Legal Defense Fund. We used the money recovered from Sarah's embezzlement, along with the money from selling the ridiculous enforcement equipment she had bought with community funds. This fund now provides free legal help to any homeowner who feels their rights are being violated. It ensures that nobody could ever again be bullied into selling their home just because they couldn't keep up with unfair standards or afford excessive fines. Gerald Foster became something of a neighborhood hero. His story inspired us to establish special protections for elderly and disabled residents. We created a senior support network that provides help with home maintenance, yard work, and dealing with official paperwork. This ensures that no one could ever be bullied out of their home again. Helen Rodriguez was elected to the new oversight board, where her natural curiosity became a valuable asset in keeping community leaders honest. I've been watching neighbors for 50 years, she told the local newspaper, and now I finally have official permission to be a busybody. Her documentation skills, which were so important in building the case against Sarah, now help ensure every community meeting is properly recorded and every decision is fully documented. The transformation of Meadowbrook attracted attention from urban planning experts, legal scholars studying HOA governance, and community organizers looking for successful models of neighborhood self-management. We started receiving visitors from other communities asking for advice on HOA reform, and I found myself giving presentations at conferences about property rights and community leadership. My barn, meanwhile, had become an unlikely tourist attraction. The sacks of cow manure that had started the whole drama were still there, still peacefully composting, and still producing the rich fertilizer that made my vegetable garden the envy of the neighborhood. I hung a small plaque next to the barn door that reads, "The manure that saved Meadowbrook." Visitors often asked to take pictures with the infamous sacks that brought down a neighborhood dictator. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Sarah's obsession with controlling every aspect of community life had ultimately led to the creation of the most democratic and transparent HOA governance system in the state. Her attempts to grab power for herself had resulted in a system where power was so spread out and limited that no future leader could ever abuse their position the way she had. Tom Bradley won a regional Emmy Award for his investigative series. He still visits from time to do follow-up stories on how Meadowbrook has thrived under its new governance model. Property values actually increased after Sarah's departure as word spread that our neighborhood had solved the HOA abuse. problem that troubled so many other communities. As for me, I continue to farm my wheat, tend to my vegetables, and serve the community in a way that is focused on service rather than control. Every morning, when I walk past my barn and smell the earthy richness of composting cow manure, I'm reminded that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that others overlook or misunderstand. The story of Meadowbrook has become a case study in how communities can reclaim their power from abusive leadership. It shows how ordinary citizens can use legal knowledge and patience to overcome institutional bullying, and how the truth always comes out when people have the courage to stand up for what's right. But most importantly, it's a story about how a simple misunderstanding over the contents of some brown sacks led to the discovery that our neighborhood's biggest problem wasn't commercial wheat storage, it was an abundance of a different kind of organic material altogether. In the end, Sarah Martinez learned the hard way that when you try to rule through fear and intimidation, you eventually run into someone who knows more about the rules than you do. And sometimes that someone is just a quiet farmer who understands that the best fertilizer comes from patience, proper preparation, and letting natural processes take their course. Whether you're growing tomatoes or growing justice, the same principles apply. Give it time, tend to it carefully, and eventually you'll harvest exactly what you planted.